Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law. Today we shall discuss The New American Militarism, a book about what, in the author's opinion, and in the opinion of many others too, our country has become. The author of The New American Militarism, who is with us today, is Professor Andrew Bacevich. He is a former professional military officer who is now the director of the Center for International Relations at Boston University. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Andy, thank you very much. Since we have moved studios and are located right near Boston University, it seems like about half our people only have to go 3 or 4 blocks, which that's better than from Los Angeles, you know?
Absolutely.
Andy, they are going to be showing on the screen a quote you used from James Madison, which fundamentally talks about war being the font of all evils for a democratic or any society. Why did you use that quote? Our readers, our viewers, will be able to read the quote while you're talking if they wish. Why did you use that quote?
Well, as many other people do, I wanted to kind of call on the authority of the Founding Fathers to make a point. But it was also, I think, to try to remind my readers that this view of viewing military power and war in particular as worrisome, as problematic, as perhaps even inconsistent with our freedoms, that view was once very widespread. Yeah. I mean, there was a time not too long ago when Americans, I think, instinctively understood that. And this is a way of this is at the beginning of the book, of noting that the fact that we have forgotten that notion ought to give us pause. Yeah. That what Madison said, and one could cite other founding fathers on the same theme, something that I think urgently needs to be revisited. That we have become infatuated with military power, and that's not good for the country.
Yeah, you know, during the time of the Mexican War, around that time, Lincoln said exactly the same thing at greater length. And I sometimes think, Andy, that because of where you and I come from, we both come from, as we were discussing, Chicagoland, the greater Chicago area, there are things in our minds which I sometimes wonder if there are in others. Last time you were on the show for the American Empire, you looked at me and said, Larry, did you ever think when we were kids, did you even know where Afghanistan was? Had you ever heard of it? I hadn't, you know, and so... well, we see, and I said, no. I think perhaps we see things somewhat the same because we have the same general type of background. You make the point, Andy, as part in this quote and many times throughout the book, I think it's a major part of this book personally, that American democracy cannot survive another, what, 10, 20, 50, some unknown number of years. We cannot survive this as a democracy. Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, in the context of our thinking about military power, I think on a number of fronts. One would be the enormous costs of military adventurism. I mean, we're talking here in October of 2005. The deficit is something on the order of I think between $400 and $500 billion a year. We're spending a couple $1 billion per week in Iraq. We're engaged in these wars at the same time when we have pressing domestic concerns. We've just experienced Hurricane Katrina. And in a very fundamental sense, I think there's a question of whether or not we can afford these things. Yeah. Who is to pay the bills? Yeah. Well, right now nobody's paying the bills because it's all being done on deficit spending. Yeah. And maybe I'm old school. I'm certainly not a sophisticated economist, but I can't help wondering if someday the bills are going to come due. Yeah. So that's a problem. Yeah, another aspect of the problem seems to me with regard to democracy is that wars tend to concentrate power at the center. I mean, one of the themes of my book is to try to meditate a bit on the way that the office of the presidency has, in many respects, now become the office of commander-in-chief, and the way in which the president as commander-in-chief exercises virtually unchecked authority. Yeah. I mean, the truth is, a history of the 20th century, however one would evaluate all of our wars and military interventions. I mean, I myself would evaluate some as appropriate and necessary, others as frivolous and mistaken. But however one would evaluate them, the truth of the matter is that any time any president has wanted to go to war, whether it was Woodrow Wilson in 1917 or whether it's George Herbert Walker Bush in Panama in 1989, whenever a president has wanted to go to war, he's gotten his way. That the voices of the people, or even the presumed constitutional responsibilities of the Congress, have not prevented him from doing that. And that strikes me as something that anybody who values democracy ought to be concerned about. That amount of authority on that crucial question of when to go fight ends up being concentrated in one individual.
With all the consequences that follow in train, which was one of the points that was made in the selection that was up on the screen. Andy, how about the following idea along the same lines? Tell me what you think of it. The fact that we are so extended with literally hundreds of bases all over the world, that we have been engaged in bombings of various nations, that we have been fighting wars, and now the Muslim world is reacting against this. This almost guarantees that we're going to be subjected to attempts at retaliation. Today they're known as terrorism. Who knows what they will be tomorrow? But that in turn causes your society to close in on itself as you attempt to protect against the terrorism, causes people to think a diminution of civil liberties. Does this factor into your thinking?
It absolutely does. I mean, I would not be one who would denounce the Patriot Act across the board, but certainly there are questionable parts of the Patriot Act, and the Patriot Act is a reminder that when we are in a military emergency, that civil liberties tend to be, if not necessarily under siege, although they have been at some times, at least under a threat. And to the extent that the emergency becomes permanent, then the threat can be a dire one. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the aftermath of 9/11 is that the current President Bush declared that we were engaged in a global war on terror. Yeah. And that name stuck. Yeah. And it's one that sort of rolls off our lips now, but the name itself really ought to give us pause. A global war. I mean, this is a war that, to listen to the administration, has no boundaries. Yeah. It's a war against terrorism, which, as innumerable commentators have said, is a tactic. I mean, it is not a political entity, a political movement. Yeah. And, although not contained in the title Global War on Terror, the President and other senior officials have repeatedly said that this is an open-ended enterprise. Yeah. I mean, there's no Berlin to capture that is going to enable us to say, well, we've accomplished our purpose and now we can go back to something other than war. This is viewed as a war that literally could go on for generations. So just the language or the way of conceptualizing our response to the threat posed by radical Islam, and I think it's a real threat, but just that way of conceptualizing it, it seems to me ought to give people pause.
You make the point later in the book, and you've already said on the point, that the Congress has gone along with this, and in their last authorization of war, it's pretty much open-ended, that the president can fight anybody he wants for as long as he wants, as long as he finds some way of tying it to 9/11. That's a recipe for war forever.
It is, and you know, we've come to, I think, accept this notion that Congress is sort of paralyzed by the concern that to challenge the president on war policies leaves Congress open to the charge of failing to support the troops.
Right.
But in our history, in important wars, there have been times when the Congress actually has been very assertive. I mean, the classic example, I think, is the Civil War, when the Congress formed a joint committee to, I think, for the investigation of the war. It was a standing committee that was intended to provide critical congressional oversight into the conduct of the war.
Right.
And the people who participated in that committee were not unpatriotic. They were not against the Army. They were not even against Abraham Lincoln. But they saw a continuing congressional responsibility to participate in the management of the war rather than simply deferring to the commander-in-chief. We've forgotten that, but we need it.
They were, in fact, the most pro-hawkish of the war hawks of that time. They were the radical Republicans. And then we had something like that called the Truman Committee in World War II.
That's how Truman actually first achieved a certain amount of national prominence. Was running that committee.
So, you make a couple of other points, Andy, that I don't hear made very often because I spend too much time listening to lawyers. And lawyers don't know, really, it's almost fair to say they don't know about, well, of course, technically they know about, but they pay no attention to the preamble of the Constitution. What is your view of the role of two things here, the role of the preamble of the Constitution and the role of the, in that preamble it says that this is done in part to provide for the common defense and as well the general welfare, the common defense. What is your view of the role of defense historically in America?
Well, I mean, I take the Constitution very seriously. And the preamble is an important, it may be the most important part of that document because it's the document that lays out the purposes of this compact. And with regard to what we would call national security policy, it says that the purpose of this compact, among the purposes, is to provide for the common defense. And it doesn't say that the purpose is power projection or empire or transformation or spreading democracy. That the law of the land says that the core of our purpose with regard to military power is to protect this experiment in ordered liberty so that it can be preserved, so that we can work our way through the complex challenges that we face. And again, I'm simply struck by the extent to which those important words just no longer command any attention from policymakers who are trying to explain why we have to invade this country or bomb that country or send peacekeeping troops to this third one. In some respects, some of those enterprises might be admirable enterprises, but that's not the purpose of this union. And it seems to me that the purposes, the founding purposes of the union ought to still guide or bound the actions of those who lead us.
I have occasionally heard it said, I find it difficult to credit that somebody could say it, but I've occasionally heard it said, well, you've got to remember the founders lived in different times and we're under major threats now and have been since 1940. This country was never weaker or more under siege or more under threat than it was when the Constitution was written, when we were some two-bit little backwater country and Britain and France and even Spain were the major powers of the world whom we had great reason to fear every day of the year.
And indeed, I mean, the founders were definitely not pacifists. I mean, the founders were wary of military power, but the founders also understood that military power had utility. I mean, had we not used violence, we would not have won our independence. And certainly it's not the purpose of my book to argue in favor of a pacifist disarmament. The aim of the book is to say, let us rethink our understanding of military power so that we can use it prudently. Because I think that the founders themselves were very much sort of, they were realists and wished to be prudent in their understanding of what military power can do and cannot do.
Andy, you come to this. I have told you on the phone that I have been struck when I have seen you on C-SPAN, and this perception has occurred to me more than once. I've been struck by this to the extent to which you are deferential and even apologetic. I think that's a fair word. Apologetic to these groups like the Foreign Relations Council, before whom you appear at dinners and so forth and make an hour's speech. And so I have two questions. Why do you feel the need, and I understand it because I often feel the same need, though people who see me on television would probably not credit this, but I often feel the same need to apologize to people whom I'm about to tell that their views they're out of their minds. Secondly, you bring to all this a most unusual background for somebody who holds the views that you hold. So if you could address those two things, I would be grateful.
Well, I mean, my aim in the book, and my aim in appearances like this on your show, is to persuade people, I do think the truth in almost any field is complicated. Yeah. So I try not to advertise myself as the guy who is the sole possessor of the truth and everybody else is stupid. But to try to engage people in a conversation that will call them to question some things that perhaps they take for granted that they shouldn't. So I don't mean to be apologetic and deferential, but I guess I do mean not to come across in a way that is shrill and arrogant, as tends to be the case in a lot of public discourse, especially if you listen to AM radio.
Yeah, and so, sometimes back in Chicago, one aspect of it, we used to say, don't be a wise guy.
Yeah, don't be a wise guy, So I think that explains my approach.
Yeah. And the other part, what is your background? Because it's most unusual for somebody with your views.
Well, I grew up in Chicagoland. Part of the time I lived in Chicago as a young boy. My dad was going to medical school at Loyola of Chicago. Right. Although he was from Northwest Indiana, the Calumet region. Oh yeah, and really most of my boyhood days were spent in that northwestern quadrant, right outside of Chicago. We were Catholic. My parents certainly were conservative, probably more in the sense of being traditionalists, not in an ideological sense. I don't think they really were ideologically conscious in a left-right way. I went to a Benedictine boarding school for high school, so I spent 4 years under the tutelage of Benedictine monks who were terrific. And then went off to the military academy for college and graduated in 1969 and went to Vietnam. Everybody was going to Vietnam about then.
From West Point. And
And then for a variety of reasons decided to stay on in the Army. I think my wife and I sort of made the decision about 8 times. You know, we'd come up to a point where we'd say, maybe we should go do something different, and we'd say, well, not yet. So I ended up staying in the Army for 23 years. I got out in 1992 and then was very fortunate to have a chance to become an academic and teach and write.
But for somebody who holds the views you do, to have been brought up in a traditionalist Catholic home, to have attended West Point, to have been in the service, and as you describe it, to still hold socially, culturally conservative views, this is a different background than one often sees from people who believe as you do. I'd like to turn, if we may, Andy, to the subject of what are the hallmarks, in your judgment, of a militaristic nation. And I think in your book I've identified something like 10 or 12 that you discuss. Let's start with the idea that a belief, A, in the use of force, and B, in the efficacy of force are a hallmark.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things I want to emphasize to your viewers is that I understand militarism is a very loaded term. Certainly when I was growing up in Chicagoland, if somebody had said militarism, the images would have been of Germans and Japanese and not Americans.
Absolutely.
But I do try to define what I mean in the book. And yes, I think, you put your finger on it, I think in many respects the paramount manifestation of this new American militarism is this belief that we have come to have as a people. It's not simply neoconservatives, or it's not simply George Bush, but the belief that we have come to have as a people in the efficacy of force. That I think beginning especially with the experience of Desert Storm in the first Persian Gulf War, but following on that experience with a variety of other interventions, we persuaded ourselves that this very competent, high-tech military force that we had evolved had unraveled the basic mysteries of warfare, and that therefore the United States of America at the end of the 20th century was somehow uniquely equipped to use force in precise, predictable ways in order to achieve its political purposes. And not only that we could do that, but that our capacity to do that was recognized by other nations, and that therefore this potential would cause others to become more deferential to our purposes in the world. And that was a delusion as it evolved in the 1990s. It was a delusion because it completely overlooked the entire history of warfare, in which war has not been precise and economical, but has almost always given rise to unexpected consequences. And that delusion has been very much exposed, I think, with the Iraq intervention.
Why do you think, now my directors and producers here are going to start screaming at me to take a break, but I want to get out the answer to a question, and we'll take a break after that. Why do you think that was, Andy? I remember back in 1989, 1990, one heard a lot of talk about the peace dividend, which evaporated due to the kind of thinking that you were talking about. And if one looks back over history, you've alluded to this. Well, the British thought that they had the world by the tail when they had the Royal Navy keeping the peace for 150 years. The Romans thought it. Everybody thinks it. World War I, well, it led to World War II. World War II, well, it led to the, et cetera, et cetera. So how did this delusion arise that said, well, now we have manufactured the answer of answers and things will be different from 1990 onward?
In many respects, I think the central chapters of the book try to give a comprehensive answer to that, but let me give you a very brief answer, and that would have to do with the remarkable coincidence of the end of the Cold War and the experience of Desert Storm. The two are not related, except they happen one after the other. I mean, the end of the Cold War, which I believe occurred in which military power had only a peripheral role in bringing the Cold War to an end. I think it primarily came to an end because communism collapsed.
By the way, that's a very crucial point you make in the book. Everybody thinks that Reagan spent the Russians into bankruptcy by building up our military. You don't agree with that.
I think it's the Pope, it's Solidarity, it's Soviet dissidents, it's Václav Havel, it's the enormously courageous people who had the courage to say that the Marxist-Leninist emperor has no clothes on. But nonetheless, I mean, to get to the point, the Cold War ends and is read by Americans as evidence of the superiority of our system, to which I'm fully committed. I believe in liberal democracy. But the superiority of our system and the superiority of the United States of America. Kind of coming on top of that then is Operation Desert Storm, which is badly misread in terms of what it really signifies, but is read at the time as this unprecedented victory. And so those two events together, in a sense, take us into the 1990s with a sense of confidence in our role in the world, combined with a sense of confidence in what the American military establishment can achieve that has all kinds of negative consequences.
Okay, we'll go back, we'll come back and we will go investigate the reasons which you have given in extenso, as one might say, in the book that carry out your theme. Stay with us. After a short public service announcement, we'll be right back with Professor Andrew Bacevich.
Misfits in America is the first volume of a quartet called Thine Alabaster City's Gleam, written by the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law, Lawrence R. Velvel. Misfits in America, like the entire quartet, is a collection of stories, events, and incidents that illustrate basic problems which arose in America in the last half of the 20th century and continue today. Misfits in America discusses the extensive decline in honesty in our country, the increasing extent to which success is not determined by competence and diligence, the replacement of modesty by celebrification and bragging, the rise of elitism, and the growing concern with one's self to the exclusion of any concern whatsoever with the welfare of others. It also discusses in the national political sphere the gross failure of judges and congressmen to do their constitutional duty, so that we suffered the debacles of Vietnam and now Iraq. Misfits in America has been praised by leading American scholars and authors like Howard Zinn, Amitai Etzioni, Richard Falk, Lyle Denniston, Robert M. O'Neill, and others. It has been called a page-turning account. To obtain a copy of Misfits in America, contact the publisher, the University Press of America, at 4501 Forbes Boulevard, Suite 200, Lanham, Maryland, 20706, at 800-462-6420, or at its website. Or contact the Massachusetts School of Law, 500 Federal Street, Andover, Mass. 01810, 978-681-0800, or at their website, www.mslaw.edu.
Welcome back. And Andy, your last comment leads me to ask you to explain your views about the neocons, because it's widely thought, and I guess correctly thought, that the neocons are the people whose thinking was responsible for the way the country went after 1989-90, after Russia, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, collapsed, and we won this smashing victory in the Gulf War.
There's a chapter in the book that's devoted to the neoconservatives, and I would want to emphasize that I'm not one of those who thinks that the neoconservatives are whispering in President Bush's ear, or that they're standing behind the throne and they're pulling the strings. I think that greatly overstates their influence on U.S. policy in the last few years. Having said that, they have influence. They have had influence. And the influence, I think, is to make plausible a set of propositions that do inform the present administration's policies, and propositions that, were it not for all of the agitation and arguing that the neoconservatives did over the previous 20 years or so, would seem silly, seem beyond the pale.
They sort of prepared the public to respond affirmatively to this by, if I may use the word, propagandizing for 20 years.
Prepare the public to respond, but also, I think, provide a set of ideas or notions that policymakers can draw on to help them explain or justify what they are about to undertake. I mean, the neoconservatives, they are a fascinating group of people who emerged from the American left really at the very end of around the very end of the Vietnam War. People who were appalled by the new left and their perception that defeat left the United States enormously vulnerable to a Soviet Union that was on the rise. And so they set out to reverse the verdict of the 1960s in a cultural and social and political sense, but also they set out to try to rebuild American military power. They didn't reverse the verdict of the 60s.
Yeah.
The 60s won, like it or not.
Yeah.
But they did succeed, particularly during the course of the 1980s and the Reagan era, with helping to bring Americans around to a conviction that we were vulnerable and that there was an imperative to rebuild American military power, and that there was an imperative that we be willing to use American military power. So that's basically their intellectual legacy, I think, as it pertains to the American militarism that I try to describe.
And unless I miss my guess, and I don't know that you said this particularly, I don't remember, you may have, but certainly I've read many times that a lot of their ideas, Andy, are abstractions without any evidence in their favor, maybe no evidence against either, but they're abstract. For example, the notion that an historical Islamic society is going to spring to democracy, that it even wants democracy, that these people will greet us with rose petals in the street. You know, where the evidence was for that is beyond me.
I mean, I think they would say in their defense that they're not ahistorical. I would say, criticizing them, that their use of history is enormously selective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, for example, to take the point about democratizing other nations or peoples, from their point of view, the pivotal moment is 1945. Yeah. And they would say that, look how the United States brought democracy to Germany and Japan.
Yeah.
And that based on that, we can do the same thing in Iraq or in Afghanistan or wherever. Well, Germany is not Iraq.
Yeah. Yeah.
1945,
Yeah.
a nation and a people that have been flattened by 6 years of total war is not Iraq in 2003, in which a very brief military intervention topples the Ba'athist regime, but does not necessarily lay Iraqi society open to our rebuilding according to our own notions. So I think that they use history very selectively to suit their preconceived notions.
I have, in the last couple of weeks, had people on, Andy, and we've discussed related subjects, including the complete destruction by bombing of both Germany and Japan. And when you see the pictures of what those societies were like in 1945, you got to say, you could have done anything.
Well, and in particular, I think you would say with Germany that even apart from the extent of Allied destruction, there were the makings of a civil society.
Yeah.
There were people who had experience with democracy.
Yeah.
There was a cadre of people who turned out to be enormously effective leaders. Konrad Adenauer, Ludwig Erhard, who came to the fore. I mean, I think a better argument about 1945 is not that the United States somehow gave or imparted democracy to Germany, but that we were partners with the Germans who were committed to creating a new and democratic political order, and that we facilitated their effort. And it seems to me that those sorts of people, those conditions, don't necessarily exist in the places that the Bush administration wants to bring democracy.
And to whatever extent Japan was different from Germany, there was enough in Japan that we could do it there too, and Iraq is not Japan either after the war. Andy, explain the role of Wilsonianism in what happened after 1990.
Well, I mean, Wilson, I think, continues to be truly the dominant figure in American foreign policy. Dominant because his legacy, the ideas that he propounded, from time to time fall a little bit out of favor, but they always return.
Yeah, yeah.
And paramount, I think, among those ideas is a conviction that democracy is universal, universally applicable, that the United States, that Providence has endowed the United States with a mission.
Yeah.
And that mission is not simply to serve as a city upon a hill, to model democracy,
Right.
but the mission is to use American power in order to bring history to its destination. Now, not every American statesman has fully subscribed to all that.
Yeah.
I think some of our greatest statesmen probably were somewhat skeptical of that.
Yeah.
I happen to be a fan of Eisenhower. I
Yeah.
think that he would be a skeptic.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But with the end, neoconservatives are committed to those propositions, and with the end of the Cold War, again, the time seemed ripe.
Yeah.
American power seemed so great.
Yeah.
Our capacity to act seemed to be limitless.
Yeah.
The world seemed to be malleable.
Yeah.
Alternative ideologies had been discredited.
Yeah. Yeah.
That the 90s become a neo-Wilsonian moment
Yeah.
that carries beyond 9/11 and influences the Bush administration in very important ways.
You know, Andy, the idea of the city on the hill, that goes back to John Adams, Tom Paine, George Washington, Thomas
Winthrop.
Jefferson. Pardon me?
John Winthrop.
John Winthrop.
Yeah.
I guess he first coined the phrase. But that's what it was, the city on the hill, the model, not using armed force to impose our values on others, but being the example that others can follow. Wilsonianism is a whole different kettle of fish, I gather. Andy, let me ask you this. You point out that the military is now endowed with almost a supernatural respect as being the repository of honesty, efficiency, competence, of various highly desirable traits when people feel that all around them in the civilian society it has been lost. What accounts for this great respect that is now accorded to the military?
Well, I mean, of course, they deserve respect.
And I don't doubt that,
deserve
quite
respect for
frankly.
what they do. But how do we get to this notion of the military being omnicompetent and that all other agencies of government are incompetent? I think that...
I might subscribe to the latter, but anyway.
Well, I think that much of that comes out of the 1980s. Much of it can be, I think, ascribed to the political strategy of Ronald Reagan, who you may remember quite consciously used soldiers as part of his effort to shake the country loose from the so-called malaise of the Carter era and to restore this sense of self-confidence. But it's, you know, again, we're talking here in October of 2005 in the aftermath of Katrina, perhaps on the eve of a bird flu epidemic. And I have been struck by the proposals by the Bush administration, but also sort of the commentary in the press about expanding the role of the military in disaster relief, or of using the military to quarantine parts of the population if there's an epidemic. And again, it attributes to the military a capacity and a competence which I really wonder if they have. I mean, again, here in October of 2005, if we look at the military, which is primarily organized to fight wars, and which is certainly fighting gallantly in Iraq and Afghanistan, it hasn't won either of those two wars. So the thing we pay them to do, they're hard-pressed to do. Now, these are tough, hard, complicated wars. But I myself would like them focused on fighting those wars, not worrying about what to do with the next hurricane. Secondly, with
Can I
regard...
interject something?
Yes.
And then come back to the secondly? I'm glad you said what you said, because I've been struck by the same thing. That is so contrary to the ethos of America from 1787 onward. The whole concept of a standing army and using it to maintain the peace or do good in civilian society, other than the Corps of Engineers building dams and so forth and rivers. This is startling when you look at it through American history, isn't it?
I think it is startling. I mean, if the Department of Homeland Security or FEMA are broken, then let's go fix those.
Now, I have one other question. We'll get to your secondly, but I have heard it said recently, Andy, and I think there's a lot of merit in it. And you've been in the military. I have family in the professional military. I have heard it said recently that one of the reasons the military is thought to be able to accomplish so much and it's held in such high regard is that, unlike so much of civilian society, at least political civilian society, the military is objective-oriented. And of course, it has the power of command, so that when you tell people, go do this, they go do that, and the object is, get it done. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that?
Well, it's true to an extent. It's not true to a full extent. I mean, the military is a political institution in and of itself. I'm sure every officer gets out of bed in the morning and says to himself, I'm going to go do the best for my country today. But when they get to work, a lot of them end up trying to do what's best for the Army, yeah, as opposed to the Navy, yeah, as opposed to the Air Force. Yeah. And decisions and priorities are established that really reflect institutional self-interest rather than necessarily what's best for the country. Yeah. I mean, in terms of competence, we are spending something on the order of about $500 billion a year on the United States military today when we take operational requirements into consideration. And the amount of money that is wasted is mind-boggling. Yeah. I mean, the cost overruns in weapon systems are simply stupefying and probably ought to qualify as criminal. Yeah. So the military has its own internal problems of management and getting the job done. And it's those notions that cause me to say that to expand their portfolio, yeah, to lay more on top of them, is just flat out a bad idea. Yeah.
Now, you were going to say, secondly, if you remember where you were going with that.
I was going to get to the waste.
We'll go. Okay, so you've gotten to that already. Mm-hmm. Okay, we have to take another break. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Professor Andrew Bacevich.
The Massachusetts School of Law offers opportunity to persons who would otherwise be frozen out of law schools and the legal profession. When making admissions decisions, MSL looks at all aspects of the candidate's academic and work histories and does not consider the LSAT. We also make law school affordable, with tuition that is only half or less of most other New England law schools. MSL's teaching and standards are rigorous. Our students learn to analyze deeply, to write well, and to speak fluently. As lawyers, they compete on equal terms with graduates of any other school. They also use their training in business, government, and other fields. An education in MSL can put you on the road to a better professional and business life. For information about MSL's full-time and part-time programs, call us at 978-681-0800 or write us at 500 Federal Street, Andover, Mass. 01810. Or for information and to see the school online, visit our website at www.msl.edu. Books of Our Time is presented by the Massachusetts School of Law. The winner of 25 awards since 2002 for excellent television programming, Books of Our Time brings you leading authors for one-hour discussions of major books they have written. The authors include Pulitzer Prize winners, historians, political scientists, lawyers, scientific writers, reporters, and other experts in a variety of fields. The subjects of their books include American wars and foreign policy, American domestic history, economic subjects, college and professional sports, biographies, higher education, and many other fascinating topics. Books of Our Time helps carry out MSL's commitment to provide excellent television programming that provides the public with information on important subjects. Watch Books of Our Time on Sundays on CN8, the Comcast network, for interesting, in-depth, and sometimes humorous discussions of fascinating topics.
Welcome back. Andy, let me summarize a couple of things briefly and then ask you a question. We have sort of touched on the idea that we now maintain this really enormous military. We spend $400 billion a year on it, which is more than the rest of the world put together or the top 20, depending on who you believe, put together. We've never before had a standing army like this prior to the Cold War. We always demobilized after our prior wars. And today we maintain this standing army, and with it, we maintain, and this is what I really like to ask you about, we maintain bases all over the world and take the position that we must constantly expand our periphery in order to become safer. You say that this is not making us safer, this is making us less safe. Why do you say that?
Well, this, Chalmers Johnson has a great phrase for this. He calls this our empire of bases. And the first thing, I think, is simply to note that there is a very strong tendency that once we establish a base somewhere, we never leave that place.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean we keep every base, but we're 60 years after World War II, we're still in Germany. Germany's not threatened by anybody. Yeah. 60 years after World War II, we're still in Japan. 50 years after the ceasefire in the Korean War, we're still in Korea. South Korea is abundantly able to defend itself. So the first thing is simply this problem of once we arrive, we never leave, even when the purpose of staying there has long since been satisfied.
Not to mention Rota in Spain and Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. I think we finally are leaving Uzbekistan, where they boil people in water.
Well, they kicked us out.
Yeah, they kicked us out. But I mean, we are everywhere. But go ahead.
Well, and the assumption is that presence buys you influence in a positive way. I wouldn't say that that assumption is always wrong. I think there are cases where the assumption is correct. I'm not in favor of having no bases overseas, but there are many cases where presence buys you trouble. That the presence of our military is in and of itself an irritant that causes us to be attacked. And therefore the base, having the presence or the base becomes the excuse to have the conflict.
By the way,
the perfect example, I think, is Saudi Arabia, where we have left since we invaded Iraq. But we had never had a permanent military presence in Saudi Arabia until Operation Desert Storm. Desert Storm ended in an incomplete victory, in which Saddam Hussein was able to remain in power. The fact that he remained in power then became the basis for the then first Bush administration arguing, well, we need to stay in Saudi Arabia in order to contain Saddam Hussein. So we do. The Saudis, I think, quite reluctantly signed up to that. Well, the immediate implication of that was, of course, terrorist attacks on U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. Remember the Khobar Towers bombing? The longer-term impact is that whether it's pretext or genuine motivation, but from Osama bin Laden's point of view, it's the U.S. military presence in this holy land of Islam that provides the rationale for him to attack us on 9/11, and we're off to the races in a global war on terror. So my view would not be that, hey, all bases are bad, bring everybody home. My view would be that first of all, we should probably do a top-to-bottom scrub of which bases actually serve our purposes and are necessary, and that we darn well ought to be very circumspect about expanding this empire of bases any further.
As a lawyer, Andy, I have dealt since I entered law school in 1960 with a kind of thinking which is often called worst possible case analysis thinking. Oh, Your Honor, if you permit this result to occur in this case, then X and Y and Z, which are all horrible things, are going to occur in cases A, B, and C. There is a certain amount, it's very stark. One always forgets that there are other things which will intervene to make the situations not as similar as they seem when one abstracts just one or two pieces from them. I gather that the neocons engage in a kind of stark thinking like this. Gee, if we don't stay in Saudi Arabia, then they'll know that they can kick us out by dropping bombs on Khobar Towers or so, and then, you know, we're off to the... That's kind of a hallmark of American thinking these days, isn't it?
It is, and that's another, you're pointing out one of the ways in which neoconservative ideas have kind of permeated, I think, rather broadly in our society, and you're exactly right. I mean, the neoconservative thinking, or this idea, I think, really harkens back to the 1930s. What was perceived to be the key truth, and it's not untrue, may not be the key truth, was perceived to be the key truth of the 30s, that to show weakness in the face of evil is to invite the most monstrous consequences, that it was appeasing Hitler that produced the Holocaust.
Right.
And I believe that neoconservatives in particular, but not them alone, have come to believe that we need constantly to be projecting strength. Strength equals military power. Strength in this idea equals the willingness to use force.
Right.
Or we're going to see the 1930s revisit themselves. Right. There is another view. I mean, again, it's not a view in favor of being weak, but it's a view that says, no, that strength comes from living up to your ideals.
Yep.
That if we in America can devote ourselves to being the best democracy that we can be, if we can demonstrate that our values are good values, if we can demonstrate that we don't intend to dominate the rest of the world, that perhaps at least some of those threats abroad will subside.
You know, I think it's fair to say, at least it's my personal opinion, that the reason the North rallied to the standard in the Civil War and stuck with it through some very trying times, and the reason that the United States citizenry rallied behind Roosevelt in 41 and 42, is that the people felt this is a good country that's doing the right thing. It is in possession of ideals, and you know, with all the problems of slavery and this and that, we're trying to live up to our ideals, and we do it better than other countries do. When you get involved in wars all the time, your people are going to ultimately lose that sense, I think, and then you are in big trouble.
I think so, especially if it becomes, if people begin to get the sense that the war is not really directly related to their own well-being. And I mean, to go by the polls with regard to Iraq, there's more and more Americans that are reaching that conclusion about the Iraq war.
One of the reasons the President and Donald Rumsfeld are fighting the way they are in Iraq is because of the question of the revolution of military expectations, and because of what Creighton Abrams, it was thought at the time wisely, but I think now one might think ineffectively did, in causing the Reserve and the National Guard to be integrated with the regular Army. Would you address those two questions, what Abrams did and the revolution in military technology?
Yeah, the revolution in military affairs is an idea that really spun out of the very last stages of the Vietnam War, which saw the introduction of precision weapons to the battlefield. And some theorists, probably most of them working in places, defense think tanks like the Rand Corporation, during the 1980s, concluded that properly used precision weapons, or more broadly, information technology incorporated into the military establishment, would enable us to achieve levels of effectiveness that were orders of magnitude beyond anything that history had ever seen. Rumsfeld, I'm not sure how much President Bush grasped of all that, but Donald Rumsfeld certainly was a true believer in this revolution. And we saw his imprint in the planning for Operation Iraqi Freedom. First of all, I should say, we saw his thinking in the conduct of the invasion of Afghanistan, done with air power, handful of special operation troops, sort of crack the enemy regime, it quickly topples. We saw an effort to repeat that success in Iraq. Remember all the talk of shock and awe being the mechanism whereby we were going to very quickly defeat Saddam Hussein. But we also have seen in Iraq the limits of this revolution. We have seen that regardless of how smart and good you are, that your adversary always has a counter. And that the counter to the revolution in military affairs is a very traditional one. It's guerrilla warfare. It's insurgency. and we find ourselves, as we have many times in the past, hard-pressed to deal with that kind of a threat.
Einstein once said, I don't know what the next war, what weapons the next war will be fought with, but I can tell you that the one after that will be fought with sticks and stones. And our opponents are going back to the sticks and stones. One of the things that fascinated me about what you said, we now have women in the military, just like the Russians had a sniper battalion of women, just like women have been in the North Vietnamese and in the Israeli military. And I think that the revolution in military affairs paved the way for this, because it is literally the case that women would sit in front of consoles 5,000 miles from the battlefield, watching people through a predator drones, television camera, press a button and kill 10, 20 people at one time. Some woman in the United States. Women never used to fight before, except for people who pretended they were men in the Civil War.
Well, I do think that this conception of warfare did sort of coincidentally serve the purposes of the women's movement.
Yeah.
I mean, from the perspective of the women's movement, the military matters because the military, as an important national institution, has been in the vanguard of social change, if you take the experience of African Americans.
Right.
And so leaders in the women's movement wanted to improve women's opportunity in the military in order to achieve their larger political goals. And the prospect of war being high-tech, not dirty,
and not
made it more
civilians.
Plausible to argue that women should play a larger role.
And not allegedly, because of precision weapons, not killing civilians.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Of course, again, if we look at Iraq, we find that, sorry for all the talk of a revolution in military affairs, war really hasn't changed all that much, and we still need husky 19-year-old males that can carry a 100-pound rucksack and go for 2 weeks without a shower, because that's what war in Iraq is.
And indeed, what we also find now, I understand, Andy, is women themselves are on the front lines, because just by being in Iraq, you're on the front lines, and they're getting ripped apart by bombs just like the guys are.
Yes, they are.
Yeah. Andy, what did Abrams do and why, and how's it worked out with the integration of the Reserve and the National Guard into the Army's professional military army?
Creighton Abrams, of course, was the successor of General Westmoreland as a senior commander in Vietnam, then was the successor for General Westmoreland as the Chief of Staff of the Army in the early 1970s. The Army thought that it had been sold down the river in Vietnam, that it had been basically abandoned by the country and badly abused by the civilian leadership. The Armies believed that one of the reasons that it had been abandoned is that when Lyndon Johnson went to war in Vietnam, he had refused to mobilize the reserves. And Abrams, as the leader of the Army after the war, vowed that that would never happen again. And so when he reconfigured the Army after Vietnam, meaning reconfigured it now looking towards the future, he did so in a way that put into the reserve components functions that were crucial to the conduct of any large-scale campaign, meaning he was trying to tie the hands of any future president and make it absolutely mandatory for that president to mobilize the reserves in order to fight a war.
And to have the support of the public.
And by extension, bring the people on board.
And we've seen what happened.
Well, what's happened, of course, is that we now are running the reserves into the ground because of the need to commit them to a long war in Iraq, and indeed, in some cases, commit them to multiple tours.
And exactly, the same guys are doing 2 and 3 tours, and he's lost almost completely lost the consent of the government, one might say, the support of the public.
Yes.
We have to wrap it up. Thank you very much. I appreciate
thanks very
it.
much, Larry.
You know, keep up the good word and don't be the good work, and don't be apologetic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I am folding the pants.
Do they go on my head?
Everyday moments can become teaching moments because learning starts long before school does. Give your child the start they need at bornlearning.org.